The land was quiet in a way that pressed against the chest as if silence itself had weight. He rode slowly across the prairie, the creak of leather saddles and the steady clop of hooves the only sound to compete with the wind. The man was not old, though war and sorrow had carved years into his face. He was built solid, broad across the shoulders with the kind of posture that came from marching more than 1,000 miles under the sun. His name was Caleb Mercer, though no one in Wyoming territory much cared. He carried no family, no companions, only the battered remains of a cavalry coat rolled up on the back of his horse and a deed in his pocket, a yellowing piece of paper that claimed, by law, the land he had come to find. The ranch waited for him at the edge of the high country, abandoned for years. From a distance it looked skeletal, a main house with half its roof torn away by storms, a corral fence leaning like broken ribs, a well that had long ago gone dry. Some men would have turned back at the sight, called it cursed land better left to dust, but Caleb had chosen it precisely for that reason. He did not want neighbors, did not want prying eyes. He wanted solitude, the kind that either mended a man's soul or buried him before the first thaw. On his first night, he built a fire inside the drafty house. Smoke curled up through gaps in the rafters, carrying with it the scent of damp pine and charred earth. The wind clawed at the shutters, howling across the ridge. He told himself it was only the storm, only the breath of the mountains. But then, somewhere beyond the hills, a different howl rose, higher, sharper, alive. Wolves. The sound made the hair rise on the back of his neck, not from fear, but from recognition. Like him, wolves were creatures of exile, condemned to survive outside the warmth of towns and churches. He listened until the fire burned low, wondering if that lonely chorus was greeting him or warning him. Days bled into one another. He mended fences, patched holes in the roof, cut wood until his arms ached. Each task was a ritual, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. Yet every night as darkness crept in, he heard the howls, sometimes near, sometimes distant, sometimes echoing so close it seemed they circled the ranch itself. Still he did not see them. Not until the third week when the storm came. Snow fell hard and sudden, turning the world white by dusk. Caleb fought to secure the roof tarps, his hands raw from the cold. He barely heard the first sound, not a wolf's cry but something stranger, thinner. It was a voice broken and ragged, carried on the wind. He turned, heart hammering, scanning the tree line. And then he saw her. She moved like a shadow between the snow-laden pines, her hair a wild tangle that whipped in the gale. She wore no shoes, only a rag of cloth tied across her shoulders, and her skin was pale with frost. At her side padded 3 wolves, their eyes glinting with a light that was neither wholly savage nor tame. Caleb froze, his breath clouding. He thought at first she must be a vision, a fever dream conjured by cold and hunger. But the girl's eyes, sharp, amber, animal, locked with his across the distance, and he knew she was flesh. For a long moment neither moved. The wolves growled low, their breath steaming. The girl crouched, baring her teeth not in madness but in warning, as if she herself were part of the pack. Caleb's hand drifted to his revolver, but he stopped himself. A single wrong gesture would turn this fragile moment into blood. Instead, he raised his hand slowly, palms out, showing he carried no threat. The storm broke their standoff. The girl hissed something, not words, but a sound that stirred the wolves to retreat. Together they vanished into the storm, swallowed by white. Caleb stood alone again, but nothing felt the same. The image of her burned into his mind. A child of the wilderness caught between human and beast. He could not shake the thought that she belonged to both and neither, a secret the mountains had kept from men until now. Sleep would not come that night. He sat by the fire, haunted by questions. Who was she? How long had she lived among the wolves? Was she abandoned, or had the wild itself claimed her? By dawn, only one certainty remained. The ranch was not as empty as he had believed. When he rode into town a few days later for supplies, he made the mistake of asking quietly if anyone had ever heard of a girl roaming the woods. The reaction was swift and uneasy. The storekeeper spat tobacco into a tin and muttered about the cursed one. A woman clutching her child crossed herself. The preacher, overhearing, stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Best you leave such matters alone, he warned. The devil keeps strange company in these hills. Caleb said nothing, but he carried the words with him on the ride back. The wolves were not the danger. Men were. Fear twisted into rumor, and rumor grew into hate. He had seen it before, in battlefields where enemies were turned into monsters by the mouths of frightened men. And he knew then that if the girl lived, truly lived, she would not be safe if the town ever laid hands on her. That night, when the wolves sang again across the ridge, Caleb listened not as an outsider but as one who had been chosen to bear witness. Somewhere out there, a girl moved between two worlds, and whether he wished it or not, their paths were bound together. Caleb did not expect to see her again so soon. The storm had passed, the world washed clean under a pale, indifferent sun, and life at the ranch settled into its old rhythm of fence mending and wood cutting. Yet every task seemed haunted by memory. Each creak of timber, each whisper of wind against the eaves reminded him of the girl crouched in the snow, her hair a snarl of frost, her eyes gleaming like firelight reflected on steel. She had been there and gone in a blink, but the echo of her lingered in the marrow of his bones. He told himself he had dreamed it, that no human child could survive in such wilderness with nothing but wolves for kin. But when dusk fell and the howling began again, that fragile excuse collapsed. The chorus sounded closer this time, circling the ridge as if testing boundaries between one world and the next. The next morning, Caleb rode out along the frozen creek, leaving the ranch behind. Snow crunched beneath his horse's hooves and his breath hung heavy in the brittle air. He carried no rifle, only a sack of jerky and bread tied to the saddle. It was a foolish errand, he knew, to seek what wanted not to be found. Yet something beyond reason pulled him forward. He had buried comrades on fields where no birds dared sing. He had walked away from towns that promised friendship but whispered betrayal, and through all of it he had kept his heart locked behind walls of iron. But the sight of that girl, that living paradox, human and wild in the same breath, had cracked something open. By midday, he found her. Or rather, she found him. He had dismounted to water the horse when he felt eyes on him. Turning, he saw her half hidden among the pines, crouched low, her body taut with readiness to flee. Two wolves flanked her, lean and sharp, their coats bristling against the cold. She watched him not with fear but with suspicion, the way a hawk studies movement in the grass. Caleb slowly reached into the sack and drew out a piece of bread, holding it aloft. He placed it on a flat stone and backed away, palms open. For a long time she did not move. Then, with startling quickness, she darted forward, snatched the bread, and retreated again. She tore into it with her teeth, devouring as though she had not eaten in days. Caleb made no sound, only watched. When she finished, she licked the crumbs from her hands like an animal cleaning its paws. Her wolves sat guard, their yellow eyes fixed on him, growls humming in their throats. Caleb gave them his silence, letting the forest speak instead. That ritual repeated in the days that followed. He would ride out, leave food, wait at a distance. Sometimes she appeared, sometimes not. But when she did, she always brought the wolves. It was as if she were tethered to them, or they to her, bound by a language older than words. Gradually, her posture softened. She no longer bared her teeth. She lingered longer, studying him with curiosity rather than mistrust. Once, when he left an apple, she sniffed it like a wolf scenting prey, then bit into it and laughed. A sound raw and unpracticed, yet achingly human. Caleb felt the laugh pierce him more sharply than any bullet he had ever faced. He began to speak to her in quiet tones, though he knew she could not yet answer. He told her his name. He told her about the horse, a stubborn bay he called Crow. He spoke of the ranch, the chores that filled his days, the silence that filled his nights. At first she seemed not to understand, tilting her head like a pup puzzling over a new sound. But over time she began to mimic syllables, crude and broken, shaping fragments of language with lips unused to speech. Her name, when at last she gave it, was Larka. Whether it had been given by her parents or invented in the solitude of the wild, Caleb could not know. But once he heard it, he repeated it often, weaving it into his words until it seemed to bind them like a secret pact. Yet not everyone shared Caleb's wonder. Word of his excursions spread in town. Whispers carried on the backs of wagons and across saloon tables. They called her the wolf girl, cursed child, half-beast. Some claimed she lured men into the woods to die. Others insisted she was no girl at all but a spirit in flesh, sent to test the faithful. The preacher thundered against her in his Sunday sermons, painting her as an omen of sin. Caleb listened in silence, jaw clenched, while townsfolk nodded and crossed themselves. He had seen that look before. the gaze of people searching for an enemy to blame. And he knew once fear took root, it could turn to violence faster than fire spreads through prairie grass. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in a smear of scarlet, he found Larka waiting for him near the creek. She stood without her wolves this time, alone, shivering in the cold. In her hands she clutched a scrap of fabric, the remains of some forgotten dress, ragged and torn. She looked at him, and in her eyes burned both hunger and a strange plea. Caleb slid from the saddle and knelt, lowering himself to her level. Slowly, carefully, he draped his coat over her shoulders. She stiffened, every muscle poised to bolt, but then with trembling fingers she gripped the fabric and pulled it tighter around herself. It was the first moment she allowed him near. The wolves returned soon after, growling low at the sight of him so close, but she calmed them with a single gesture, a guttural sound that held command. Caleb watched, awed. Whatever had shaped her life in the wilderness had given her a power both fierce and fragile, a bridge between two worlds. And though he did not yet understand what role he must play, he felt in that instant the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. That night the howls echoed closer to the ranch than ever before, circling in restless patterns as if the pack itself was testing the boundaries of trust. Caleb lay awake staring at the beams above him, listening to the strange chorus. The girl was no longer just a shadow among trees. She had a name, a voice, a story that demanded to be uncovered. And though the town bristled with suspicion, though the preacher warned of doom, Caleb felt his own heart whisper something different, that perhaps salvation did not lie in forgetting the past, but in protecting the wild miracle the present had delivered to his door. Caleb had always known the West to be a land of suspicion, where neighbors squinted harder at one another than they did at the horizon. Out here, gossip was as sharp a weapon as any Colt revolver, and once a rumor began its slow crawl through the saloons and church pews, there was no outrunning it. He felt it the moment he walked back into town for supplies. The air was different, taut with curiosity and unease, as though the very street dust whispered against his boots. Men stopped mid-conversation when he passed. Women tightened their shawls, clutching their children closer. The blacksmith, usually quick with a greeting, gave only a stiff nod and returned to hammering steel with unnecessary violence. Caleb kept his gaze steady, but every instinct from his soldiering days screamed that the enemy was circling, not with rifles but with words. The story of the wolf girl had grown teeth in his absence. At first it had been nothing more than a curiosity, a tale of tracks in the snow, half wolf and half human, glimpsed on lonely ridges by hunters who drank more whiskey than water. But now, with Caleb's quiet excursions beyond the ranch, the myth had hardened into something darker. The preacher fanned the flames from his pulpit, declaring that the girl was a child of sin, an omen sent to test the righteous. "She runs with the beasts," he thundered, voice echoing against the church walls, "and beasts answer only to the darkness. Mark my words, brethren. No good can come from harboring the devil's own." The congregation had murmured in agreement, some with fear, others with eager hunger, the kind that feeds on someone else's downfall. It wasn't long before fear turned practical. A rancher's widow, her herd thinned by the lean winter, claimed wolves had taken her cattle. She stood in the center of the saloon one night, eyes blazing with grief, and swore she'd seen a girl running with the pack that dragged her yearlings into the dark. Whether she truly had or merely wanted someone to blame, it didn't matter. Men who had once laughed at the legend now leaned forward, fists tightening around their mugs. Words like witch and curse were muttered into the smoke-filled air. By the time the night was done, the town had decided the wolves were a plague and anything tied to them must be purged. Caleb returned to his ranch with the weight of their voices heavy on his shoulders. He tried to tell himself it would blow over, that winter hardships always bred scapegoats, and by spring the town would have a new ghost to chase. But deep down he knew better. He had seen the same kind of hunger in men before, not for food but for righteous violence. It was the same look soldiers wore when marching to burn a village, convinced that fire was justice. And he knew what such hunger did to the innocent. That evening, as the last light drained from the sky, Larka appeared at the edge of the corral. She stood still, half in shadow, the wolves ghosting around her like smoke. Caleb felt his breath catch. She had begun to wear the coat he'd given her, though it hung loose and awkward on her thin frame. Her eyes glowed in the firelight, wary but searching. He walked toward her slowly, hands open, voice low. "They're speaking of you," he said. though he doubted she understood the words. Still, something in his tone must have carried, for she tilted her head and drew closer as if listening mattered more than meaning. Over the next days, the tension deepened. Riders passed near the ranch more often, their silhouettes cresting the ridges at dusk like vultures circling. Caleb heard rifle shots echo from the hills, wolves scattering in panicked howls. Each report struck him like a blow. Larka became harder to find, the pack retreating deeper into the forest. When she did appear, she came with scratches on her arms, eyes wide with fear, as though hunted even in her sanctuary. The breaking point came one bitter night when Caleb returned from chopping wood and found her crouched on his porch, shivering violently. She had come without the wolves, her face streaked with tears, her hands bloody where briars had cut her skin. She spoke in broken fragments, voice raw. Chase, fire, hurt. He understood enough. Someone had driven her from the woods, torches and bullets turning her world into chaos. Rage flared inside him, a heat more dangerous than the cold could ever be. He wrapped her in a blanket, sat her by the fire, and promised, though she might not comprehend the words, that she would not face this alone. But the town was not finished. 2 days later, men rode out to confront him. They came at dusk, shadows long, rifles across their saddles. Their leader, the widow's brother, called out from the edge of the property. "We know she's here, Mercer. That creature's brought nothing but blood to this land. Hand her over or we'll do what's necessary." Caleb stood on the porch, revolver at his side, his voice calm but unyielding. "There's no creature here, only a girl, and she's under my protection." The words hung heavy in the cold, daring them to test his resolve. The standoff ended without blood that night, the riders turning back with muttered curses. But Caleb knew it was only the beginning. The town had made its judgment. To them, Larka was no longer a mystery but a threat. And threats in the west were dealt with by bullet and rope. As darkness fell and the wolves lifted their mournful chorus once more, Caleb sat by the fire and stared into the flames. His solitude was gone, replaced by a cause he had not sought but could not abandon. Somewhere in the smoke and shadows sat a girl who belonged to neither world, looking to him with eyes that demanded a choice. He thought of the preacher's words, the widow's grief, the fear etched into every face in town. And he thought of her laugh, fragile and human, breaking across the silence like dawn across black hills. The snow melted slowly that spring, reluctant to surrender its hold on the high country. Drifts lingered in the shadowed gullies while swollen creeks roared with meltwater, devouring fallen branches and stones alike. For Caleb, each new season had always felt like a reckoning, the land stripping away what men thought they owned, reminding them they were small, temporary, no more permanent than tracks in the dust. Yet this year carried a different weight. He was no longer alone at the ranch. The girl, Larka, hovered between presence and absence, a shadow in the corners of his days, a fragile heartbeat in the silence of his nights. She came more often now, slipping from the woods with wolves pacing at her heels. At first she had only taken food and vanished. Now she lingered near the corral, touching the fence rails with cautious curiosity, watching Caleb work with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. Her speech, halting and broken, grew stronger each week. Words formed slowly on her tongue like drops of water gathering into a stream. Wood, horse, fire. She repeated them after him, sometimes laughing when her mouth fumbled the sounds. Caleb found himself smiling more often, even laughing in return. A strange, unfamiliar music after years of silence. But shadows gathered beyond the ranch. The town had not forgotten. Whispers carried on every wagon load of flour and every mug of whiskey. Some swore the wolves were bolder now, seen in daylight near homesteads. Others whispered of tracks, small, bare feet alongside paw prints, and shuddered. The preacher redoubled his sermons, declaring the girl a sign of judgment. Caleb heard it all during his supply trips, the weight of hostility pressing heavier each time. He could feel the tide rising, knew sooner or later it would break against his door. Then came the day he discovered her secret. It was deep in the hills, near a ridge the locals called Devil's Spine. Caleb had been tracking a wounded steer that had strayed from his half-mended fence. He followed the trail through dense pine until he heard laughter, soft, lilting, not quite human in its cadence. He reined in, heart thudding. There in a clearing was Larka. She knelt by a small fire ring, coaxing flames with hands scarred but deft. Around her sat 3 of the wolves, tails curled, watching her with the devotion of kin. And beside her, half buried under stones, lay a crude bundle, scraps of cloth, rusted metal, and bones whitened by years of weather. Caleb dismounted slowly, moving as though approaching a grave, for he knew that's exactly what it was. The girl turned, startled at first, then strangely calm. She touched the bundle, pressed her forehead against it, and whispered something in a voice so low the wind nearly swallowed it. Caleb crouched beside her. The bones, small and delicate, had belonged to a woman. Nearby, beneath another stone pile, were larger remains. A man, perhaps. Rusted wagon hoops and splintered boards told the rest of the story. A family had died here years ago, claimed by the wilderness. Their daughter had lived only because the wolves had found her before starvation did. Larka looked at him with eyes that pleaded for understanding. She touched her chest. Mother, father. The words were clumsy but clear enough. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He had buried comrades, carried children from burning homes, but he had never stood at the grave of a life stolen so young. He reached out, not to take her from the wolves, but to rest his hand against hers. She did not flinch. For the first time, she trusted him with her past. Yet even as revelation softened the air around them, danger pressed in. Outlaws had been moving through the hills, a ragged band driven from Montana by lawmen, now preying on ranches and travelers alike. Caleb had heard the stories in town, but had not expected them so close. That night, as the girl returned with him toward the ranch, torches flared in the dark. Shapes emerged from the tree line, men with rifles slung and hunger in their eyes. Their leader, a scarred man with a grin like a wolf's snarl, stepped forward. "Heard tales of you, Mercer," he drawled. "And of the little prize you've got here. Girl runs with wolves, they say. Wolves that can track better than hounds. That'd be useful to men in my trade." His gaze slid to Larka, who pressed against Caleb's side, teeth bared like her kin. The outlaw chuckled. "Don't fret, sweetheart. We'll make good use of you." Caleb's hand hovered near his revolver, though he knew he was outnumbered 3-1. Violence now would end them both. He forced his voice steady. "She's no one's prize." The outlaw leaned closer, eyes glinting. "Then guard her well, soldier boy, because one way or another she'll come to heel." With that, they melted back into the trees, leaving the night heavy with threat. Afterward, as wolves howled in restless circles around the ranch, Caleb sat at the hearth and weighed the choices before him. He had wanted solitude, a place to lay his ghosts to rest. Instead, he had found a girl whose very existence was a challenge, to the town, to the outlaws, to his own battered heart. The mountains held her secrets, and now so did he. The question was no longer whether he could keep her safe, but whether he was strong enough to fight every force, man, beast, and memory that sought to tear her away. Larka curled on the floor nearby, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her wolves lay in a circle around her, sentinels of fur and fang. Caleb watched her sleep, her face softened by dreams, and felt something stir within him that he had long thought buried, the dangerous, fragile spark of hope. And hope, he knew, was the most perilous thing of all in a land that devoured the weak. The first snows of winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high ridges like a silent army, and burying the land in white before autumn had even loosened its grip. By mid-November, the ranch was a fortress of ice. The wind screamed through cracks in the boards like a chorus of ghosts, and the sky rarely showed its face, hidden behind heavy veils of gray. For Caleb, who had once survived marches through blizzards with nothing but a worn uniform and stale rations, the cold was a familiar adversary. But for Larka, the girl who had lived half her life in the shelter of wolves and pine forests, the winter was something different, a test of belonging. Each morning he watched her adapt with a resilience that astonished him. She moved barefoot through drifts that would have felled a lesser soul, her breath white in the air, her eyes scanning the horizon with the sharpness of a hawk. Yet he also saw her tremble when the wind bit too hard, or when hunger knotted her belly because the traps came up empty. Caleb taught her how to stack wood properly, how to seal gaps with mud and straw, how to ration flour so it might last through the lean months. In return, she showed him the quiet wisdom of the wild, how to listen for the faint cracking of ice before it gave way beneath the creek, how to follow the wolves' calls to find deer hidden deep in the timber, how to trust instincts when reason faltered. For a time, it seemed they might weather the storm together, bound by shared survival. But winter in the high country was never merciful for long. Food dwindled faster than expected. The last of the cattle fell to wolves or cold, leaving only salted venison and sacks of grain scavenged from town. Then came the blizzard, a monster storm that descended without warning, blotting out the world in a white fury that lasted 3 days. Inside the ranch house, Caleb and Larka huddled near the fire, the walls shuddering under the wind's assault. The wolves paced restlessly outside, shadows darting in and out of the snow. On the second night, when the firewood pile had shrunk dangerously low, Larka spoke more clearly than he had ever heard her. She whispered her name again, but this time with certainty. Larka. Then haltingly she pointed to him. Caleb. The sound of his own name in her voice broke something inside him. For years he had carried his name like a weight, a reminder of battlefields and loss. But from her lips it was transformed, softened, given new meaning. He stared into the fire, his hands trembling, and confessed words he had never spoken aloud. He told her of the war, of the blood that stained his hands, of the comrades buried in shallow graves across fields no map remembered. He told her how he had come west to escape the noise of his own soul, hoping solitude would silence the screams that haunted his sleep. His voice cracked, heavy with shame. I thought I was already half dead, he whispered. Then you came, and now I don't know what I am. For a long while she said nothing. Then slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over his. Her grip was small, cold, but steady. In her gaze there was no judgment, only recognition. She too was a creature shaped by loss, carved out of wilderness and sorrow. And in that moment the distance between them, man and girl, soldier and orphan, human and wild, dissolved. They were simply two souls who had endured, finding each other in the ruins of their pasts. But the storm did not grant them peace for long. On the third night, as the winds shrieked and snow battered the ranch, the outlaws returned. Caleb heard them before he saw them. Shouts carried on the gale, the crunch of boots and hooves in the drifts. He pushed Larka behind him as the door rattled under fists and rifle butts. Mercer, a voice bellowed. It was the scarred leader, cruel laughter cutting through the storm. No snow can hide you. Hand over the girl and maybe we'll let you keep your skin. Caleb's revolver felt heavy in his hand, but heavier still was the knowledge that he was one man against many. He could not fight them alone. Yet as the door threatened to splinter, the night erupted with howls, fierce, guttural, wild. The wolves had come. From the darkness, shapes lunged at the intruders, teeth flashing, fur bristling. Gunshots cracked, echoing off the mountains, screams swallowed by the storm. The battle outside was chaos, man against beast, snow stained red beneath the pale light of the moon. Inside, Larka pressed against the wall, her face fierce, her eyes burning. She raised her voice in a chilling primal cry, a sound that was neither wholly human nor animal. The wolves responded, rallying as though commanded. Caleb felt the hairs rise on his neck. She was not merely a girl among wolves. She was their sister, their leader, their bridge between worlds. And now, in the crucible of blood and snow, she had claimed her power. When the storm finally broke, silence fell heavy over the ranch. The outlaws lay scattered in the drifts, some dead, others fled into the dark. The wolves circled their fallen, then melted back into the timber, leaving only paw prints and crimson trails behind. Caleb stood in the doorway, revolver still smoking, chest heaving with exhaustion. Larka stepped to his side, her hand slipping into his. For the first time she spoke a full sentence, her voice low but certain. We, together. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not the wild orphan of rumor, not the omen of fear, but a partner forged in fire and frost. In her presence his ghosts were quieter. In her presence survival was no longer an end but a beginning. Yet as dawn broke over the snow-shrouded hills, Caleb knew this was not the end of their trials. The town would hear of the battle. The preacher would call it proof of evil. The widow would demand blood, and others drawn by greed or fear would come. The war was not over, but for the first time since he had set foot on that broken ranch, Caleb no longer felt alone in facing it. The blood in the snow would fade with time. But the bond forged in that storm between man, girl, and wolves would endure, and though the mountains might yet demand their due, Caleb felt a flicker of defiance burning in his chest. Whatever came, they would meet it together. The snow was thinning, giving way to mud and thaw, but the land felt no gentler for it. The cold had loosened its grip, yet what remained was uglier. Half-frozen rivers swollen with ice, roads turned to mire, and a raw wind that carried more foreboding than relief. Caleb had known the West well enough to understand that spring never came without a cost. It stripped away the disguises winter offered, covering scars beneath white silence, and revealed the bones beneath. Now, as the season shifted, the truth of their world was laid bare. The outlaws had not been the last of it. Word of the battle spread faster than the snow melt. In the saloon, they called him a madman who had unleashed wolves upon men. In the church, the preacher raised his voice higher than ever, spitting fire and scripture. The beast among us must be driven out. The curse must be broken before it swallows us all. Some townsfolk nodded out of fear, others out of envy, jealous of the defiance Caleb showed. And in every whisper, in every rumor, Larka became less human. They painted her as a witch, a spirit, a danger that must be cut out before it poisoned their children. Caleb felt the storm coming long before it arrived. He had lived through war and knew the look in men's eyes when they had convinced themselves that violence was righteous. He stacked ammunition, reinforced the doors, and prayed that the wolves would stay close. At night, he and Larka sat near the fire, her language growing clearer with each passing day. She no longer spoke in fragments but in rough sentences, pieced together with effort and stubbornness. "They hate me," she said one night, her eyes reflecting the flames. Caleb shook his head. "They don't know you. Fear is easier than truth." She pressed closer, voice softer. "You know me." And for the first time in years, Caleb felt tears threaten, because she was right. He knew her better than he knew himself. The attack came with dawn. The first light had barely touched the ridge when riders appeared, their torches burning against the pale sky. There were dozens of them, ranch hands, townsmen, farmers turned vigilantes, all armed with rifles and hatred. At their head rode the preacher, his black coat snapping in the wind like the wings of a crow. His voice rang out across the frozen field. "Caleb Mercer, give up the girl. By God's word and the blood of this land, she must be purged." The men roared their agreement, their breath steaming like beasts waiting to charge. Caleb stood on the porch, revolver holstered, rifle in hand. Larka stood beside him, wrapped in the old coat he'd given her, her wolves arrayed like a living shield. She did not flinch. Her amber eyes burned with a strange fire, not of fear but of belonging. Caleb's voice carried across the distance, low and steady. "She's not a curse. She's a child of this land, same as any of us. You call her beast, but she's more human than the lot of you." The words only fanned their fury. The preacher raised his hand and the mob surged forward. The first shot split the morning silence. Bullets slammed into the ranch walls, splintering wood. Caleb returned fire, each shot measured, each breath steady. But he was only one man against many. Then the howls came. From the ridges, from the timber, from every hidden hollow in the land, the wolves descended. Dozens of them, fur bristling, eyes blazing, drawn by the cry of their sister. They tore into the mob with savage fury, scattering horses, breaking the charge. Men screamed, rifles cracking wildly into the chaos. Amid the storm, Larka stepped forward. She raised her voice in a keening cry, half song, half howl. The wolves turned at once, rallying to her command. Caleb watched in awe as she stood at the heart of the battle, not as a frightened orphan, but as something greater. A bridge between wilderness and man, a leader born of two worlds. She moved with the pack, guiding them, shielding him, and in her stance, in her defiance, Caleb saw the answer to every question he had carried since she first appeared in the snow. The fight raged until the sun crested the ridge. By then the mob was broken. Some lay in the mud, their torches extinguished. Others fled, casting fearful glances over their shoulders at the wolves that had turned the dawn into a nightmare. The preacher, dismounted and mud-stained, stared at Larka with horror. "She's not of God," he spat, voice trembling. "She's a devil's child." Caleb leveled his rifle at him, voice rough with fury. "No, she's mine." The preacher fled, stumbling into the timber, his shouts lost in the trees. Silence fell, broken only by the wolves panting and the crackle of dying torches. Caleb lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Larka stood beside him, her hand finding his, her face streaked with tears and soot but unbowed. She whispered, voice steady, "We live." For a long moment they stood in the light of dawn, man and girl, wolves circling around them like sentinels. The ranch was scarred, the land bloodied, but something greater had been forged in that fire. A family, bound not by law or church or the fragile order of men, but by survival, loyalty, and love. The West would not forgive them easily. Caleb knew more battles lay ahead. Whispers, riders, storms yet to come. But for the first time he did not dread the fight. He looked at Larka, at the wolves that had chosen her, at the mountains that had cradled their pain and their hope, and he felt the weight of his solitude finally lift. In a land that broke so many, he thought, as the sun climbed higher over the snow-dappled peaks, we have found each other, and that is enough.